Thank you, Jason. He makes me sound a lot better than I really am. Aloha, brothers and sisters. I just want to add one thing to that wonderful introduction. I know you've seen my husband's picture around campus and probably know a lot about his career, but I just wanted to add one thing. We've been coming to BYU Hawaii and the PCC now for almost 30 years, if you can believe it. That was long before many of you were born. And I want you to know what a deep love we both have for this place in Laie. My husband especially loves it here and has served and given much, trying to help to build it and make it better. He especially, I think, loves all of you, the students and faculty and administrators here at BYU Hawaii. He loves you for your faith. He loves you for your dedication to get an education and to the church. He loves you for your hard work, and he loves you for the light in your eyes. And I just wanted you to know that that is the context in which he speaks, with a desire only to benefit you and help you as you grow here in this wonderful place. I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Brothers and sisters, aloha. Aloha. As Jason was talking about a little bit of our background, did you realize how old we are? And we're still standing? That should give you some encouragement. I'm told, I need to find out first, how many of you have served missions for the Church of Jesus Christ? Oh, bless your hearts. This just feels like a big zone conference to me. I'm told I have 30 minutes to speak, so I'm going to make sure I don't go over. You've heard the story about the Catholic boy and the Mormon boy. He wanted to kind of check out each other's churches. So they first went to the Catholic church, and the Mormon boy saw the priest make the sign of the cross and whispered to his friend, "What is that?" And he explained what the sign of the cross was. Next week they went to a Mormon sacrament meeting, and the speaker very ceremoniously took his watch off and put it on the podium, and the little Catholic boy said, "What does that mean?" And the Mormon boy said, "It doesn't mean a thing." Well, I'll try to make sure it does mean something. As my wife said, we love you. When we served with here in Hawaii, we had a fairly good-sized mission. We had about 200 to 220 missionaries at any one time. So each transfer, we'd get between 20 and 25 new missionaries. And when we could no longer go meet them at the gate, we'd have to wait at the bottom of the escalator, as you all have to do when you come in. And so they'd come down, and Sister Willis would hug the sisters, and I'd hug all those elders, and you could tell immediately where they were from. If they were from the South Pacific, they'd just hug right back. If they were from the mainland, they'd kind of hug back, feeling a little awkward about it. If they were from Asia, I'd throw my arms around them and they'd go. But that was okay. It only took them one transfer, and we had them trained. They could hug with the best of them because they knew we loved them. The question is, how do you know we love you? You recall the scripture which says love is a gift of the Spirit. Before we come to this sacred place, we ask for that gift. So as we look at you, we not only see your faces, but we feel your spirits, and are indeed grateful for who you are and what you are. Now, how many of you have taken at least one entrepreneurship class? Interesting. Most of you have not. That's okay, because I'm not going to talk about entrepreneurship, even though they're kind of sponsoring this little discussion. I will just say, as an unpaid advertisement, you should at least take one. It will be a blessing in your life. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit about leadership. Universities are great places for ideas, and we have to have ideas to be successful in whatever we do. But it turns out that good ideas are not enough. We have to start with good ideas, but how we then go about executing those ideas can make all the difference in terms of whether they're successful or not and whether we're successful or not. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about leadership in the home, in a quorum and relief society, in a classroom, in a business, or any place else. There are certain fundamental characters about leadership that make a huge difference. And if we understand those, we can make a huge difference. And if we don't understand those, it's just a lot harder. And as I talk about a few of these, you're going to say, well, of course. They sound simple. In fact, they sound so simple that sometimes we don't realize how fundamentally important they are. For example, first principle of leadership is leaders must lead. Now, I can see your college-educated mind saying, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard anybody say. Of course, leaders must lead. It is astounding how many leaders don't lead. When I was at General Mills, one of our restaurant chains was the Olive Garden. Have anybody ever eaten in an Olive Garden?
Bring it here, please.
Yeah. I'm no longer a shareholder, so I don't care if you've eaten there or not, but I would love to have it here too. I still eat them all the time. We were out on the West Coast visiting competitors' restaurants and our own restaurants, and we happened to go to one of our restaurants, in this case, Olive Garden. We had Olive Garden and Red Lobster. And I was with the man who ran our restaurant group. And so we went up to Olive Garden on a Friday night at 5 o'clock. Now, in those days, this was long ago for me, a couple of decades. In those days, Olive Garden was so popular that at 5 o'clock on a Friday night, you should expect an hour wait. We walked up to this Olive Garden, 5 o'clock on a Friday night. There was no wait line. We walked in, there was nobody to receive us. We kind of stood around wondering what was going to happen. Finally, somebody wandered out and said, well, can we help you? I thought, well, of course you can help us. We're here to eat. So they took us to the one table in the restaurant where the gorgeous California sun was coming right through the window into our eyes. That's where they sat us down. We waited forever for a server to come. The hot food was not hot. The cold food was not cold. It was the worst experience I've ever had in any restaurant. And it was our restaurant. I was dying. The only one who was having a worse experience was the guy who worked for me, who was responsible for the restaurant. Finally, after we had this absolutely abysmal meal, I asked the server if the manager was there. And they said, well, the manager is not here tonight. Clue number one, if you're in the restaurant business, you're always in the restaurant on Friday night because it's one of your busiest nights. I said, well, is the assistant manager here? Yes. Well, the assistant manager wandered in and kind of looked around like he was on something. Well, it was California. Maybe he was on something. I don't know. But he finally wanders over, and I said, this has not been the greatest experience we've ever had. He said, well, I'm sorry. That was it. So as the head of the restaurant group and I are walking out, I said, guess what? You've always told me how responsive restaurants are to leadership. We're going to come back in 1 month. I want to see what you can do to this restaurant. We actually went back a little earlier than 1 month just to surprise them. Again, on a Friday night, walked up, 5 o'clock, huge standing line. Took us 45 minutes to get seated. The hot food was hot, the cold food was cold. It was a completely different experience. So after we'd finished, I called the new general manager over. I said, let me guess, you probably have about 120 employees in this restaurant. I said, that's right. I said, out of those 120, how many did you have to fire to make this complete change in the performance of this restaurant? You know what his answer was? 1. I didn't ask. I hoped it was that assistant manager, but I didn't ask. All the rest was leadership. It was a matter of setting expectations, training people to meet those expectations, and then holding them accountable to meet those expectations. And oh, by the way, everybody in that restaurant was happier because they were busy, they were earning more tips, they were having a better time. Everything worked better because that new general manager knew how to provide leadership. If you're in a situation, whether you're responsible or somebody else is responsible, it's not a function of title, it's a matter of leadership. What can we do to make this situation better? Second principle, leaders set high standards. Have you ever noticed the standard the Savior set for us? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Oh my goodness. Some would say that's just a matter of the most discouraging thing anybody can ever say to us, to set a standard so high we can't meet it. But what happens is when somebody sets a high standard, we look at where we're supposed to be and where we are and realize we have to change. It's why you wonderful return missionaries saw miracles all the time in your mission as people started to change to try to close that gap between where the Lord wants them to be and where they were. Same thing works every place, in any place. Again, when I was at General Mills, we had a man who was responsible for all our production facilities around the world. And he calculated at one time, every time we'd often produce multiple products in the same plant. And every time we needed to change, they'd have to stop the production line, break it down, clean it off, put new parts on, clean it again, and then start it up. The average time in each one of our plants to do that was about 3 hours. He calculated how much that cost us for that 3 hours of downtime every time we changed, and it was in a very large sum. So he called all the people in responsible for the plants and said, guess what? New standard, 10 minutes. 3 hours, 10 minutes. And they looked at him like you're looking at me. There's no way. He said, yes, that's the new standard. You figure out how to do it. Well, they walked out of there saying, my goodness, our jobs are at stake. Well, I don't know if they were really at stake, but they went out and said, we've got to figure out a way to do this. Somebody got the idea to go to a NASCAR pit stop. Have you ever seen those things? The cars come in, the tires go off, the tires go back on, they're out in about 15 seconds. They took a videotape of what happened in the pit stop and went back and said, how can we apply this to a changeover in our plant? When I left General Mills to go run Times Mirror, 11 minutes. 3 hours to 11 minutes. Because they realized they couldn't make small changes and be successful. They had to do something dramatically differently, so they looked outside for a different way to do things. And by looking outside, they got a new and better idea, applied that to the plant, and made that dramatic change. I was bragging about that one day to a man at a business dinner. He ran a company that made great big huge engines and other kinds of things. And so I was just feeling kind of happy about what we'd done. I told him what we'd done. He said, well, that's very interesting. I said, have you ever done anything like that? He said, yeah. He said, our changeover time was 10 hours. I said, what's your new standard? He said, 10 minutes. I said, well, how do you do it? He said, we went to the NASCAR pit stop, took a video, went home, 10 hours to 10 minutes. It forces you to make a discontinuous change if you set a high enough standard that you can't continue to do things the way you used to do it. Now, I watched and marveled when I watched a high school principal do this. This was a grade school in Southern California, and a grade school that served a community where 90% of the students were poor, meaning the school fed them lunch. Also meaning, if they were like other poor students in that same school district, 90% of them would never learn to read at grade level by the 3rd grade. In his school, virtually every student read at grade level by the 3rd grade, and many of them read at grade level in 2 languages, not 1. And so I said, I've got to see this school. So I went over and met this principal. Now, I need to be a little careful how I say this, because the President Tanner's here, and I don't want him to think I'm teaching you to be disobedient. I'm not. Please don't take that. But he worked for a dysfunctional school district, unlike BYU, which is run perfectly with fantastic leadership, so you never have to worry about this. But the school district was totally dysfunctional. So what did he decide to do? He was so concerned that those students learn how to read and do other things as they should, he broke virtually every rule. He didn't wait for the school district to do anything because he knew they never would. He went to businesses and people like this and said, I need books. I need a piano. I need violins. I need to paint the classrooms. I need to do this. I need to do that. And so he got the resources, not from the school district, but from everybody else. And then at the first of the year, every year, he'd call all the students in and their parents. And they'd sit in a big room like this, and he'd say, I know who you are. I know most of you come from a country other than the United States. I know the courage it took for you to come. I know the difficulty involved in learning this language and learning to function in a country that's not your own. I admire you, and I admire your children, and therefore my expectations for you are up here, not down here. And anytime your child is not performing up here, we're going to call you in and talk about it. Nobody had ever done that before with parents. Most of them came from countries where the parents stayed out of the way and the school teachers were honored to do the education. And he said, no, you're going to help us do this. And that's exactly what they did. And those students performed up here. I went and visited that school and had them read to me in 3 different languages, and they did it beautifully. I had them perform music. I had them do all kinds of things. It was stunning what he had done, because he had the courage of leadership and said, it's up here, not down here. Can you imagine going to college and saying, whoopee, I can hardly wait to be average? No. You set your own standards. You're your own leader. Just make sure you set them up here. Principle number 3. Great leaders empower others. I was in a business meeting in Europe one time with a man who ran a company from Holland. And he told me the strangest story I'd ever heard. He said he'd been at a meeting in Berlin right after the wall came down. And one of the guests was late. And the guest was late because he happened to be responsible for the heating plant in their community. Turns out when the price of oil went very high, the East Germans had decided that decisions about the consumption of fuel were so important they couldn't leave it to individuals, so they centralized energy. And by centralized, he meant literally centralized. There was one plant, the plant provided the heat to all of these great big massive buildings, and they set the temperature in the plant. Well, fine, I guess. Problem was, when the wall came down and the economy started to fall apart, people left the plant. And it was winter, so no problem, heat's still going in. But when summer came, it was hot as the dickens, and heat was still going in the apartments, and nobody knew how to turn down the heat. Because they didn't trust others to make decisions about heat. Nobody's smart enough to make all the decisions on their own. Doesn't matter what job you're in, what you do, where you live. You have to find a way to trust others, because together you can do more than you can ever do on your own. We have a man in our stake who served as a stake president about 50 years ago. Told me a story that has had a remarkable impact on me. When he was stake president, now 50 years ago, there were so many people on his stake, in his stake on welfare, they were drawing down $100,000 a year in church welfare funds. In today's terms, that would be over $1 million. So $1 million a year, in effect, in welfare fund. And he looked at that and he said, this is impossible, we can't have this. They had a stake welfare project of a dilapidated pasta factory, which was horrible. He said, this will never do. So he found out that he could buy some used pasta making equipment from a place up in Oregon. He had in his stake a man who worked for the railroad who had mechanical ability. He'd never worked on a pasta line before, but he had mechanical ability. So he sent him up there, borrowed $200,000 from the church. This was a time when actually stakes owned their own welfare project. I know you can't even believe that, but yeah, we're old enough, we actually remember that. So he borrowed $200,000 from the church, sent this guy who knew nothing about pasta up because he trusted him. That man went up, watched them take the equipment apart piece by piece so he knew how to put every piece back together again. They shipped it back. In a matter of about 3 or 4 months, they had that pasta plant up and running. And they produced the pasta, but they had everybody who was on welfare either help produce the pasta or package it, for which they earned a wage. They were so successful that not only did they not have anybody on church welfare, but over the next few years they turned $1 million back to the church. That'd be the same as $10 million today. Why did it work? Because he was creative and because he trusted that people could do things they'd never done before. And he showed that trust by helping them do it. And it was astounding to see what happened. Next principle, leaders kindle passion. I don't know about you, but I marvel still that 18, 19, 20-year-old kids from all over the world go all over the world to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. When we served for 4 years in the MTC, we'd watch you wonderful people come in. Oh, we loved every one of them. We had a branch that had 8 languages: Tongan, Samoan, Fijian, Marshallese, Kiribati, Haitian, Creole, American Sign, and Malagasy. We didn't speak any of them, but we loved the feel of them. In a fast and testimony meeting on Sunday, we'd have languages born in at least those 8 languages, testimonies born in at least those 8 languages, sometimes 9 or 10, if they came from a place where they hadn't learned enough English to do it in English or their mission language. Every time they do it, we would feel it. Why did they come? Why did you go? Why did you go around the world? Why do missionaries still go around the world? Because you feel it in your heart, and you give up everything to go do it. Thank heavens. Journalists, we had about 1,000 journalists in one newsroom in Los Angeles. Total across our system at Times Mirror, we had 2,000 journalists. Some of them would risk their lives to get the story because they were so passionate about what they did. It's important to be passionate about what you do. During World War II, there was a great big shipyard out on the West Coast. That shipyard was turning out a battleship every 6 months. people working in the shipyard said, wait a minute, this will not work. We have family and friends who are dying in this war. We need to figure out a way to do it faster. Wasn't a manager who did it, it was leader employees who just decided they had to figure out a better way. By the end of the war, they were turning out a battleship every 6 days. 6 months to 6 days. Because the people in that plant said, this is not tolerable. We've got to find a better way. When you can tap into the passion of people, miracles take place. It's one of the things we love about coming here. We have these wonderful students talk to us about their projects, and we see the passion and feel the passion that they have. It's no wonder they're not only changing their lives, but they're changing the lives of others. Remarkable to watch it happen. Well, let me just make one more point and then I'll stop. Leaders have to be trusted. This is really a whole other talk, which we won't have time for today, but let me just assert that if leaders can't be trusted, sooner or later, they will lose their moral authority to lead. And when someone has lost the moral authority to lead, unless they can force people to follow, which some try to do, sadly, followers will leave and they will not be successful. Thankfully, we all live in places where we cannot and should not force people to lead, to follow. Therefore, if we're going to be effective leaders, we must, in every day, in every way, prove that we can be trusted. Have you ever wondered why the brethren are so totally and completely trusted? Because we know we always can. Have you ever wondered why President and Sister Tanner do such a marvelous job? Because they are totally trusted by you and by the brethren who are counting on them to lead you. By the way, I hope you have seen in everything we've talked about that the Tanners personify every principle we have discussed. Now, my 30 minutes is up, according to my watch. It did mean something to put it down. I understand I can respond to questions, or you can leave and go do something a whole lot more fun. Your choice. Any questions? No questions. We get to go have lunch early. Oh, who ruined it? Who ruined it? Okay.
President Willis, my question for you would be, what's the greatest way that you've seen to develop leadership?
Aloha. I want a hug after. Yeah, I recognize you. One of our MTC missionaries. What's the best way to develop leadership? Find really great leaders and just follow what they do. Interestingly enough, in a mission context, I would give some of our missionaries the same kind of training using the Savior as the example. If you think about how he leads the church, he does everything we've talked about, only better. I mean, he is the perfect example in everything, including leadership. And so if we literally take seriously what he did and the way he did it, we have the perfect map to be great leaders. Second point, just do it. Just do it. And then when you find you've made a mistake, which you will, because I have, we all do, then you just learn from that mistake and do something else. Does that make sense? Okay, next question. By the way, glad you survived your mission.
I have a question about what would you say you can do to kind of develop more trust from, like, as a leader or from your followers or the people you're supposed to lead?
Say again exactly what your question is.
So, like, how can you gain more trust, or how can you, I don't know, like, increase the power of that trust?
How can you gain more? Did you hear the question? How can you gain more trust? The most important thing to do for people to trust you is to never break trust. In other words, if you make a promise, you do it. If you say you'll do something, you'll do it. It's why when these wonderful missionaries would come into our branch in the MTC, one of the first things we talked about the second night they were there was exact obedience. Because if missionaries are exactly obedient, people will trust them. If they're not exactly obedient, people will not trust them. Exactly that same principle applies to everything we do everywhere we go. Does that make sense?
How do you find your passion?
How do I what?
Find your passion?
How do I find my passion? Well, I just meet with fantastic students like you. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. It's interesting. People ask us, because we lived first in New York and then Philadelphia and then Minneapolis and then Southern California, and then we were here for 3 years, and then I went back and ran some business for the church for a while and so on, and people ask me, where was your favorite place to live? Everywhere. Everywhere. Because everywhere there are wonderful people like you, and that's what makes all the difference. That makes sense? Now, how do you find your passion in business? That's a little more individual, right? Some people get really turned on by little microbes. I'm not one of those. I'm not real passionate about getting into the biology lab and having those little things look up at the microscope and wave at me. I mean, that's just not me. On the other hand, there was a time when I was at General Mills and I was passionate about Hamburger Helper. Believe it or not, I really was, because our margins on that product were absolutely stunning. I mean, it was amazing. So you just have to find what works for you. Does that make sense? One more? No more, please.
Should you always be doing what you're passionate about, or are there times in your life where it's acceptable to do stuff you don't like as much in order to get?
Oh, that's a very good question. The question is, was I always able to do what I like to do, or were there times when I had to do things I didn't want to do? Okay, confession is good for the soul. The answer is yes, there were times when I absolutely had to do things I didn't want to do. When I was at General Mills and I was president of the company, but not CEO, and because I was young and stupid, I really thought I should be CEO. And one day, the CEO said to me, "You're not going to be the next CEO of this company." And I thought, I'd really like to be CEO someplace. If not here, I'll go someplace else. So I walked out of his office absolutely determined to go find another job. But having learned that the Lord has a plan for us, which he does, I thought, well, first I need to talk to my wife, and then I need to pray about it. So I talked to my wife. She said, let's go. I mean, we're in Minneapolis for all places. Why not go someplace else, especially if it could be warm? But I prayed about it and could not get confirmation to leave. I didn't like the answer, but that was the answer. So turned out I kept praying regularly, and for 5 years, stayed in a job I really didn't want to stay in because I couldn't get confirmation to leave. All of a sudden, one day, I prayed about it, and the Spirit said, yeah, now's the time. I thought, great. So what I really wanted to do was go to a place where I could make things. Tractors, cars, I didn't care what it was. I just wanted to make stuff. So I went to a headhunter, executive recruiter, and talked to him, and he said, yeah, we can probably do that. And he said, by the way, would you like to talk to this company on the West Coast that's about $2 billion in newspapers and another $1 billion in magazines and other things. I said, no, I'm not interested. I want to go a place where I make stuff. He said, okay. So I get on the plane and I'm flying back to Minneapolis, and the Spirit says to me, you dummy, you call him back. So I landed, called him back. I said, can I change my mind? I'd be happy to talk to them. Flew out and talked to the people at Times Mirror. And after the first set of interviews, they took me to the hotel, and I'm driving through a part of Los Angeles. Well, I would have felt a whole lot better if I had an automatic rifle to protect me. I mean, it was not comfortable. And we're driving through this place, and I'm thinking, who on earth would want to live here? And I get into the hotel room and stood at a window. Had no job offer. But I stood at the window, and the Spirit said, you're supposed to be here. So I called my poor wife. I said, I don't have a job offer, but we're moving to Los Angeles. I never did dare ask her what she thought of that conversation. Finished the interviews the next day, obviously got an offer, and that's where we went. Turned out, it was useful for the church to be in that kind of position. So the Lord had me wait until that particular position opened up so that I could go take that. So yeah, lots of times we have to do things we don't like. But if we're on the Lord's agenda, if we're on the Lord's plan, it actually turns out well. Now, as long as you ask, I'll tell you one more story. We were at Times Mirror 5 years, and when we got there, the company was just sinking like a rock, and during that 5 years, we not only turned it around, we were booming. I mean, we were growing every business, every line item, by volume, it just didn't matter. We were on a roll. And the stock had gone up about 5 times. And the attorney who represented one of the founding families who owned a majority of the voting stock walked into my office and said, we've just sold the company. I haven't told this. Can this just be between us? This is not a story I tell, but I think you need to hear the story. Walked in and said, the family has sold the company right out from under me. I was so angry. I don't usually get real angry, but I was so angry. You've heard the term, I could spit nails. I could spit nails. I wanted to spit them right at him. I mean, I just was so angry I could hardly say. First and only time in my entire life I refused to shake somebody's hands when he left. I could not believe it was happening. And continued to not understand why, after all we'd worked so hard, all we had done, why it would be taken away from me just when it was really getting good. They asked me to teach at USC. BYU asked me to teach. I thought, well, we'll go to BYU and teach. So we moved to Utah. No sooner had we moved to Utah than they called us to preside over a mission, which ended up being here in Hawaii. The Lord had a better plan than I had. What turned out to be the greatest disappointment in my life turned out to be the greatest blessing in our lives. Because we not only left a pressure cooker of a job, but we got to serve a full-time mission among the most wonderful people in all the world. The Lord has a plan for you. He knows you. He loves you. And he trusts you. And if you will stay close to him and listen to him and follow his promptings, you will be on his plan, not your plan. and it will be the best plan you could ever have. I promise. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you very much, Father Willis and Sister Willis. That was more than inspiring. We are very grateful. We would like to invite Sister Paula Patong to come up and give a gift to you at this point. So if you'd like to come stand back up here, both of you.
In ancient times, Polynesians immigrated to islands across the Pacific in search of exploration and discovery. They anticipated the risks and set their sail for an exciting new beginning across the seas. One of the most important factors in their journey was making sure they had the best vessel that would provide a safe journey for their precious cargo, their future, and their families. Just as the early Polynesians depended on their vessels to create a future for their families, Mark and Laura have done the same with their generous donation to the Willis Center. We hope this replica of the Yosepa canoe will remind you of the journey we have enjoyed thus far with you.
We'll just hold it up like this. You have to know that when we were here serving in Hawaii on our mission, this canoe was being carved right out by Kamehameha Highway. And several of our late nights as missionaries, when we were wending our way back to the mission home in Honolulu, we stopped and carved, which people could do. We helped carve this canoe in our own little way, so thank you.